This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
The name of this podcast speaks volume for the type of content I like to cover on every episode. This is Sports Forgotten Heroes. I concentrate on players time has forgotten, teams that we don't remember. Every once in a while, I do stray a little bit, but still, even when I do, it's usually about a player whom we don't necessarily recall. This episode, however, is about a player baseball fans debate about all the time. Shoeless Joe Jackson. Many say he is deserving of induction into baseball's Hall of Fame. Yeah, sure. We know about the 1919 Black Sox, but who was Joe Jackson, and just how good was he? Next on Sports Forgotten Heroes, instead of discussing Joe and the Black Sox, we're going to talk about his career and just how great he was.
This is Sports Forgotten Heroes, a tribute to the stars who shaped the games we love to watch and the games we love to play. Stars who provided us with many thrills, but when their time was up, they faded away. We'll take a look back at their spectacular careers, their moments of fame, even if it was just for one season or just one game. And now, here's your host, Warren Rogan.
Hello and welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes, episode number 131, Shoeless Joe Jackson. So, yeah, like I just said, he is not forgotten. In fact, every year when baseball inducts someone new into the Hall of Fame, Joe's name inevitably comes up. I think for many that's because that's the thing to do, jump on the bandwagon. But how many out there really know just how great Joe Jackson was? How many know that Joe was actually discovered by Connie Mack? That he first played for the Philadelphia Athletics and they gave up on him in less than 2 seasons? Or that he played for the then Cleveland Naps, who later became the Cleveland Indians and are now known as the Cleveland Guardians? That he was traded to the Chicago White Sox mid-season 1915 for Ed Klepfler, Brago Roth, a player to be named later, and $31,500 in cash. Joe had a terrific 6-year run with the Naps, batting .375. In fact, his first year with Cleveland after he was traded by Philadelphia, he hit .408. But the Naps were a second-tier team, and the White Sox needed a player like Joe to get over the hump and return to the World Series. So they made the trade. Joe got off to a slow start with Chicago, and then everything fell into place. So like I said, we're not going to dive into the Black Sox scandal. Rather, we are going to explore the career of Shoeless Joe Jackson, how he got his nickname, the reason why he was unable to read, how he got his start in the game, and like I said, just how great he was. And he was great. Joining me on this episode of Sports Forgotten Heroes to discuss the career of Joe is David Fleitz. David has written many books on stars of the game, including Shoeless, The Life and Times of Joe Jackson. Of course, before we get there, a few reminders. Please follow Sports Forgotten Heroes on X at SportsFHeroes. Follow on Facebook, and please give Sports Forgotten Heroes a 5-star rating or write a nice review wherever you can. You can also watch this episode on YouTube on the Sports Forgotten Heroes channel. I record each episode on video and add stats and more. Give it a watch. And as always, thanks for your support. Okay, enough of that. Let's get into today's show about Shoeless Joe Jackson with my guest, David Fleitz. David, welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes. I'm thrilled to have you aboard.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's nice to be here.
Yeah. It's a really interesting topic, a slight departure from what I normally do. Um, I talk about guys who most sports fans have never heard of or have, as the title suggests, forgotten. Um, I don't think that Joe Jackson is a name, Shoeless Joe Jackson is a name that people have forgotten because every year when we talk about the Hall of Fame, right, two names always come up: Joe Jackson and Pete Rose. And more recently, McGuire and Bonds and the like. But I think from the outside looking in, we all know about the career that Pete Rose had, the career that McGuire and Bonds and Clemens had. But what about Joe Jackson? We all say, well, he deserves to be in the Hall of Fame. Why? Why does he deserve to be in the Hall of Fame? And so I'm reaching out to you, and maybe we could answer that question and talk about not the scandal, but actually about Joe Jackson's career. What do you think?
Well, well, first of all, I think it's surprising, it amazes me that I wrote this book 23 years ago. It was the first one that I wrote. Excuse me. And and I've thought a lot about that too. I think I've written the only biography of Joe Jackson that says, yes, he took the money, and no, he shouldn't be in the Hall of Fame. But, I can be persuaded. Okay. But it is amazing that every time Pete Rose comes up, Shoeless Joe Jackson comes up too. And I made the observation once that, if Joe ever gets in the Hall of Fame, a lot of that publicity is going to go away. They're not going to, because all that controversy will be over then. But like I said, I can be convinced. He was a fantastic player, though.
And that's what I want to talk about. If we were to take, and it's hard to do this, you take the scandal away, you take the money away, you take that movie 8 Men Out away, Joe Jackson probably deserves to be in the Hall of Fame just based off of his playing career. So I want to ask you, who was Shoeless Joe Jackson and what made him such a special ball player?
Well, Joe Jackson was a totally natural ball player. He didn't study. Well, of course, they didn't have film then or anything. I don't know how he would get along today with a film and exit velocity and all that kind of thing. But he just went up to the plate and swung the ball. It's just a see ball, hit ball with him. But he was so physically gifted that he could do that better than, well, just about anybody. And he was fast. Unless in his younger days, he was very fast. He was an outstanding fielder. He just did everything wonderfully right on the baseball field. And he was, what I found out, he was such a good athlete in the minor leagues. He pitched too.
Oh, wow.
They'd wave him in from the outfield. He was kind of the closer on this Greenville Spinners of 1908. I also found out that he did switch hit in the minors too. He could bat right-handed. Sometimes he would do it in exhibition games. He never did it in the regular season though. But that's how amazing an athlete he was.
Hey, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask, where did the nickname Shoeless actually come from?
Well, back in Greenville, he was a very popular player, but he had a pair of new shoes and they were blistering his feet. So he decided just to play in his stocking feet one day, and he slid into third with a triple in his stocking feet. And the reporter for the Greenville News started calling him Shoeless Joe, and it stuck. He really didn't like it a whole lot. He came to terms with it because it kind of made him famous and colorful and all that. But that's why he was called Shoeless Joe. He really did play one game in his stocking feet.
Can't even imagine. It must have had really tough feet.
Well, sure. In the fields at the time, in the lowest minor leagues in the South, you'd think there'd be, broken bottles and things in the outfield.
Yeah. Hey, compared to other ball players during the same period of time, how did Joe stack up against the likes of Ty Cobb and Tris Speaker, Eddie Collins, and Sam Crawford?
Oh, he was totally on their level. He was very much like Cobb. He was a left-handed hitter who had doubles and triples power. I know in his first full year with Cleveland, he stole 41 bases. He might not have had the drive of Ty Cobb. Cobb had more drive and more drive than anybody in the world, but he was absolutely on that Cobb, Speaker, Collins, Crawford level.
Let's go back a little bit. We're talking about Shoeless Joe. I swore I wouldn't do this, but here I am. I'm about to do this. In the movie 8 Men Out, Joe is depicted as an illiterate. Of course, times are different back then, and Joe was not illiterate because he didn't want an education. Rather, he had to work to help support his family, even from a very early age. Can you talk about that at all? What his upbringing was like and how he had to help support his family?
Yes, well, he grew up in this little town called Greenville, South Carolina, which only, had about 10,000, 15,000 people. And the town was built around its mills. And West Greenville, where he grew up, was all centered around this textile mill. And everybody went to work there to probably earning pennies pennies per hour, of course. But when he was only 6 years old, he started, they put him to work at the mill sweeping floors. They gave him a broom and had him sweeping floors. They did that instead of going to school, if they even had schools then. I know my great-grandfather, who would have been about Joe's age, he didn't go to school either because they didn't have any. And this is in Ohio, rural Ohio. But so Joe, from the age of 6 on, worked in the mill. And as he got older and bigger and stronger, they had him doing, more strenuous jobs. Those jobs built his muscles, of course. But no, there's no evidence that he ever attended school at all.
So was there, through his family or others, was there never any consideration whatsoever to trying to help Joe learn to read and to write, or just nobody cared?
I don't think it was a big issue then. You could get through life then really without reading or writing. Now Joe could, Joe in his contracts, for example, he knew numbers. He could pick out the numbers. He knew what the numbers said. So he relied in his, as an adult, he relied on his wife, Katie, for that. Katie could read and write, and she would read the contract and tell him what was in it and all. But I guess people who are illiterate have all these strategies for getting through life. How do you order a meal from a restaurant? How do you do this or that? There are all kind of little strategies. Like one thing, they say that Joe would go to a restaurant with his teammates and he'll say, I'll have what he's having. Mm. Perhaps he would pretend to read the menu, Mm-hmm. So there are all these little strategies. It was much more important and much more common 100 or more years ago than it is today.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, if I recall correctly, the old hockey coach, Jacques Demers, he couldn't read either, and he faked his way all the way through it, and finally, towards the end of his coaching career, revealed that he couldn't read. And wow, I mean, he pulled it over on all of us. So I guess, it can be done.
Yeah, I remember that because he coached the Red Wings here near Detroit. And it must be exhausting to have to do that. But they think of strategies to do that kind of thing.
Yeah, really interesting. Pretty smart, actually.
Mhm.
Hey, where or how did Joe learn the game of baseball, and how easy did it come to him?
Well, one thing the mills did, people worked at the mills um, 10 hours a day, Monday through Friday, and then half of Saturday also. So Saturday, and of course, they didn't do anything on Sunday. Sunday was the day of rest, in the Baptist, very religious South. Saturday afternoon, the mills had baseball teams, and so the mills would have their baseball teams that would all play each other. Sometimes they'd travel to other cities nearby in South Carolina and play other mill teams, of course. And Joe, being tall and extremely athletic, Joe had very long arms too. If you wonder how somebody throws a baseball hundreds of feet, or how a pitcher throws a really incredible fastball, you're going to find out that most of them have rather long arms,
Interesting.
like Walter Johnson did. If you look at pictures of him. So Joe kept advancing on these mill teams. By the age of 12, he was playing against the adults. He just had such a natural physical gift. He almost certainly had incredible eyesight, like Ted Williams did, and incredible eye-hand coordination and all. And so he became one of the stars of the mill team in West Greenville when he was an early teenager.
Interesting. Now, I can't imagine that working in a textile mill is the desire of young boys even back then. Playing baseball, however, that's a whole different story. So like you said, he plays for the company team.
Yeah.
How does a person living in South Carolina, Greenville, South Carolina, playing for a company team get discovered? How does Connie Mack hear about Joe Jackson and discover him? How does that happen? Because I believe it was Connie Mack who did discover him.
Yes, one of his scouts. Well, Connie Mack had heard about this sensation down in the mill leagues in South Carolina. A couple of mill league players had gone to the majors, at least briefly. So not very many. There weren't too many Southerners in the majors at the time, but Ty Cobb was kind of an exception. But another avenue, too, was that people who were stars on the mill teams would get offers from semi-pro teams, industrial teams and that, who might pay them $5 or $10 or $20 to play for them on a Saturday afternoon. So that's a way to get noticed also. But the fans, the mill teams and the semi-pro teams had lots of fans. Fans would write letters to, say, Connie Mack and say, hey, we've got this phenom down here. And if he gets enough letters, he'll take, I think he sent one of his injured players down to South Carolina to say, take a look at this guy. I've heard so much about him. That really amazes me that you can, because now you have to go through high school, college, the minor leagues, and make it up the ladder. And if Connie Mack comes along and sees you and likes you, and the next day you're playing for the Philadelphia A's. So
yeah, it's crazy how it worked back then.
Yeah.
How young was he when he was discovered?
Well, in 1908, he would have been 20 years old. So that was his first professional season in Greenville. So in 1906-07, when he's 18 or 19 years old, is when he was drawing notice, and people were starting to notice how good this guy was.
Yeah, that's a whole other thing, too, that I don't think people recognize or realize or know, is that Joe Jackson was not on the White Sox his whole career. He started off with the Philadelphia Athletics and then went the I don't know, were they the Cleveland Naps? They were the Cleveland Naps, I believe, at that time. How young or how did his young age, 20, if it did at all, affect his relationship with the other players on the A's? Did this have any sort of his age lasting effect on Joe's ability to get along with others? Was there hazing, like we would call it today? What was that like as Joe joins the Philadelphia Athletics after a short stint in the minor leagues?
Well, the big problem with Joe wasn't just his age. It was that he was a Southerner and he'd never been in a big city before. He had no idea how Greenville had 15,000 people. He goes to Philadelphia with 2 million people, with streetcars and highways and, gigantic hotels and things like that. And he has absolutely no idea. In fact, he got on the train and went back to Greenville a couple times, and Connie Mack had to send somebody to fetch him and bring him back. It really was homesickness for the South, and this total inability to navigate things in the North. Sorry, and it does have to do with getting along with teammates, many of whom are veterans who aren't very nice to the rookies anyway.
Yeah. How did playing for teams like the Savannah Indians in the Sally League help Joe develop into this incredible ball player that he wound up being?
Well, that was a more familiar type of a environment for him, and he could develop his skills with people who are like him in a part of the country that he's familiar with, and that certainly helped playing in Savannah and then in New Orleans, and it gave him it gave him a bit of maturity also.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So Connie Mack discovers him. He plays it, he's playing in the minor leagues. They call him up. He debuts with the Philadelphia Athletics at the age of 20 in 1908. Has a cup of coffee with them, plays, 24 games or so, and then plays a couple of games with them. Not even, actually, he didn't even play 24 games. He barely played, he played 5 games with them in 1908, then another half dozen games with them in 1909, and then he's traded to the Cleveland Nats. Why did Connie Mack and the Athletics give up on Joe so quickly and at such a young age? I mean, heck, he was only 23 when he was traded to Cleveland.
Well, that's true, but the problem was that Joe was still very immature, and Connie Mack apparently decided that he was never going to reach Joe, that Joe was never going to make it in a big city like Philadelphia. Back then, that was like the 3rd or 4th most populous city in America. So I think Connie Mack figured that Joe could make it, but not in Philly, not with the veteran team, that was going to win 4 pennants in the next 5 years, and Joe would be a distraction. So he traded or arranged the sale of Joe off to Cleveland. Now, Connie Mack's biographies always said that he regretted that choice later, of course, because he became a star.
Sure.
But it was questionable whether Joe would succeed in Philadelphia. So they trade him to Cleveland, and Cleveland is a smaller city. Ohio is a more rural state, I think, than what you would have had around Philadelphia. Maybe friendlier, maybe more countrified. I grew up in Ohio myself, so he could have driven 20 miles out of Cleveland and found cornfields, for example. So maybe that's why he succeeded in Cleveland, where he would not have succeeded in Philly.
Well, he really did succeed in Cleveland. I mean, his first full year with the team, 1911, he played in 147 games, and he batted .408. Now, crazy to think 408. He doesn't lead the league in hitting, but he did lead the league in on base percentage, .468. He had an OPS of 1.058. Can you enlighten us a little bit about that first year with Cleveland and just how good he was? I mean, Connie Mack at this point must have really had regrets.
Yeah. Well, he really made his mark. He was ready to. I think he had matured after winning the batting title in New Orleans in 1910. They brought him up to Cleveland at the end of the 1910 season, and he hit like 387 or something like that. So I think that really showed Joe that he can. This is successful. He can do this, and I think Cleveland was a very nurturing for him type of a situation. Also, they were in fifth or sixth place at that time. They weren't fighting for the pennant like the A's were, so maybe there was quite a bit less pressure on him. But yes, he made an incredible debut season in 1911. He was, if they'd had the Rookie of the Year award then, he certainly would have won it.
Oh, without a doubt. He played for Cleveland, the Naps, for 6 seasons. Over that period of time, he hit 375, had an OPS of 983, stole 138 bases. I mean, he was as good as anyone. Why'd the Naps trade him? Why'd they let him go? What was a knock against Joe Jackson? I mean, the guy's 26 years old, 27 years old, and he's one of the best ball players in the game.
Yeah.
Why'd the Naps trade him?
Well, the Naps fell into financial problems. They were very hard hit in 1914 with the Federal League, for example. Both of the major leagues were suffered from that. Some of their best players had jumped off to the Federal League. They finished last in 1914, and then Lajoie left, the guy they named the team after. So now they can't be the Naps anymore. So in 1915 they chose the name Indians. So, but
that was in honor of another player, I think, that played for the team. It wasn't just, hey, let's be the Indians. I think one of their best players at that point happened to have been a Native American.
Yeah, that was Sockalexis, and my second book was about him. So the
I'll
first
have to back on to talk about him.
Yeah, the first Cleveland Indian, I called him, because that's what he was. But the team was in financial trouble. The owner, Charles Summers, was close to bankruptcy. He had to sell his minor league team in New Orleans, for example, and he needed to raise cash. So he had 2 star players, Joe Jackson and Ray Chapman, the shortstop, and he decided that he would trade one and build the team around the other, which is exactly what he did. So he basically put Jackson up for the highest bidder, and the highest bidder was Comiskey in Chicago, and it was something like $31,500 and 4 players, which was an incredible amount of money at the time. So that's why he wound up in Chicago, because he was one of their 2 stars, and they couldn't keep both.
Interesting. What was life like for Joe Jackson at this point? What was life like for him off the field when he wasn't with the team? And actually, did he have any friends on the team? What was his social life like? What was life like for Joe Jackson?
Well, Joe was very much a homebody, I think. I think at the end of each season, he would hurry right back to South Carolina, back to Greenville, back to his wife and his extended family. It's weird, though, that he, like other players, he had opportunities to go into vaudeville. And after the 1914 season, Joe did a bunch of vaudeville things. Oh. They would hire a player, and then the guy he'd stand there and tell stories, perhaps have a monologue and all. And Joe loved the attention. He appeared through the South mostly in these vaudeville types of things, being one of the acts, and he really loved that kind of attention. He even made noises after the 1914 season about quitting baseball and going into vaudeville.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that, because here you're talking about that. How did he do that? How did he perform? He was illiterate. I mean, he must have had some sort of memorization uh, capabilities. How did he do this?
I think so. I think that people who are lacking in one area make up for it in other areas. So perhaps he developed a really, really, really good memory to make up for the fact that he can't go look up things, he can't go read things, and also perhaps that was a one of his things that compensation. That's a word I'm looking for. Maybe that was a compensation. But yes, standing on the stage and reciting a monologue is not something you would see him doing, but he loved it. He actually wanted to quit baseball for it.
Wow, really interesting.
When baseball is what put him there, of course.
Yeah. What? How did we touched upon it. You know, with his teammates. I'll have what he's having. His incredible ability to memorize things. How did his illiteracy affect him throughout his life?
I think he became very trusting. I think, especially with teammates with the White Sox, to his detriment. I think Joe became very trusting. I seem to find that thread through his career, especially with the White Sox, and perhaps he trusted a Chick Gandil quite a bit too much, and the White Sox were definitely a team of two distinct cliques. One was the Eddie Collins clique, and the other was the hard drinking guys, like a lot of them are country guys, but the guys who like to go stumbling around the bars, like Gandil and Risberg and Joe. Joe fit in with them because Joe. Another thing that was a recurring theme in the book is that he was a drinker.
Mm.
He enjoyed drinking, so that's why he fit in with the clique that he fit in on the White Sox.
Was he accepted right away with the White Sox? He was traded midseason from Cleveland to the White Sox. Gets off to a slow start with the team, but he picked it up in 1916. So, two questions here. Why did he start so slow for the White Sox, and how did his teammates react to him joining the club? Did they accept him?
I believe they accepted him right away because they said, "Oh, great, we've got a superstar now." They were looking for the pennant, where the Naps and the Indians were just trying to stay alive. They're just trying to stay afloat. The White Sox had pennant aspirations, and so they said, this is great. We've got perhaps the best hitter in the game, and they just went out and bought him and put him in left field. So now why he started so slow, I don't really remember why he started so slow, but he did pick it up again in 1916. I remember some disappointment when he came over, like for the last 6 weeks of the 1915 season. I do remember.
I'm looking at his numbers here. I mean, you take a look at his numbers. Yeah, the first 2 years with Philadelphia, throw those out. But 387, 408, 395, 373, 338, 308, 327. Then he joins the White Sox, and it's 272. But then again, like we just said, he really picked it up in 1916, 341, 301, 354, 351, 382. Man, the guy could hit. He could just flat out hit. How important was Joe to the White Sox success?
Oh, they definitely needed hitting. That was one thing they definitely needed, and they were looking for was more offense. And Joe provided that even after that 272 of the rest of 1915. He absolutely did supply them with the offense that they needed. Remember, this is the dead ball era, and with spitballs and emery balls and all this kind of thing, the ball would be almost totally black by the end of the game because they only wanted to use one, and they're very cheap on the baseballs. So it was very difficult hitting at that time. And Jackson was a really, really incredible hitter. He would be now, but for that time, that was just amazing. So So he definitely provided the White Sox with some of the missing offense that they desperately needed.
Yeah, I mean, again, we go way back to the beginning of our conversation. Take the scandal out of it. This guy was 100% a Hall of Fame talent. I don't think anybody can question it as we continue our discussion and look at the numbers that he put up. I mean, in 1916, he had a terrific year for Chicago. He hit 341, and he had 31 triples. I think that is still a team record for the White Sox. And ironically, in 1917, the following year, he hit 301, which might have actually been the worst full season he had with Chicago, but perhaps his most gratifying, as he and the Sox, they won the World Series. They defeated the New York Giants 4-2. So we know how good he was in 1916, sort of sloughed off a little bit in 1917. But how gratifying a season was that for Joe, and of course, for the White Sox winning the World Series?
Oh, since the White Sox had won the series in 1906, and for 11 years they'd been trying to get back there. Charles Comiskey, the owner, was so proud of winning in 06 that he just did absolutely everything he could to get back on top. And during all that time, he traded managers, he traded players, and it was almost this desperation to win it again. The hardest thing isn't to win it; the hardest thing is to win it again. And as I recall, and I don't remember, Joe might have been injured some in 1917. But
he played in 146 games, but yeah, he could have missed some time due to injury. I don't recall if I read that or not.
Right, but still hitting 301 wasn't bad. It was bad for him.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't think Ty Cobb hit no 301, but still putting him into and as far as the triples are concerned, if you remember, double and triple power was considered power then, doubles and triples. And if you remember how huge Comiskey Park was, how far away the fences were, if you can get a ball between the outfielders, and Joe was still very, very fast, he was going to get a lot of triples.
Yeah, I mean, he was a triples machine. 19, 26, 17, 13, 14. He won 21, 17, 14, and his last year he hit 20. Here we are. We're talking about the middle of his prime. But 1918, unfortunately, was a lost season for Joe and many others, as they all served their country in World War I. But he comes back in 1919 and he hits 351 and helps to lead the Sox into the series against the Reds. Obviously, we know what happened, but it's still a very difficult concept to buy, at least for me and so many others. He hits 375 in the series with a home run and 6 ribbies. Tell us about his 1919 season and the series. Just how good was he that year?
Well, Joe came into 1919. He felt that he had a lot to prove. He had kind of a chip on his shoulder. 1918 was a disastrous year because he had gotten called up for the draft in Greenville. Well, instead, he went and joined a shipyard in Delaware to do war work. Perhaps because he didn't want to imagine how Joe would handle going overseas to a foreign country when he couldn't handle Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So he joins the shipyard. Well, of course, the shipyard had baseball leagues, and Joe and many other players spent most of their time playing baseball. Well, that drew a lot of really, really bad publicity, especially since many players did go over to Europe and were on the battlefield and all that. So So the guys who went to the shipyard and wound up playing baseball all the time, they got a whole lot of bad publicity. So when Joe, especially from Comiskey himself too, Comiskey really deeply criticized some of those guys, whereas Collins and Red Faber and several others actually went into the service. So Joe came into 1919 with something to prove. Perhaps he was giving it the extra effort then. And also the Sox were, 1918 was a lost season because of all the turmoil over the war. And the Sox considered themselves still the defending champions from 17, and they wanted to go get back into the World Series and do it again. So perhaps that's where his terrific 1919 season came from.
And it was a terrific year. And I promised I wouldn't go there, but, you brought it up in the beginning of the show that you are a firm believer that Joe did take money in the 19 series. Therefore, he deserves what he got. But again, I find many of us find that really hard to fathom, considering he still did hit 375 in the series, home run, an RB, 6 RBIs, played a good defensive game or games. Just how good was he in that series? Or could he have done better? Was there, in your mind, could he have done better?
Well, he didn't drive in a run in any of the first 5 games. But then, Eddie Collins only hit 226 in the series. So how can you say that? Some of the clean Sox, as they called them, claimed that Joe was and the center fielder Felsch were playing out of position and that the balls would fall in. I think there's one thing I said in the book that maybe I wouldn't say it now. There were triples hit to left field where Joe was playing, and triples usually aren't hit to left field. But what I didn't realize then is that left field in Cincinnati was a huge area. I mean, the fence was so far away. So maybe I shouldn't have said that. If I was doing the book now, I don't think I would probably mention that. So I'm not going to blame Joe for playing singles into triples or anything. But like I said, I stand to be convinced. But I think the problematic thing was that he took the money. Now, being shown $5,000 when your yearly salary is $6,000, and everyone else is taking it, I might just say, hey, I can pay some bills with this.
Yeah, sort of like Live Golf today, right? These guys are getting hundreds of millions of dollars. How do you turn your nose up to something like that?
Yeah, would I turn my nose up at 100 million? I don't know.
Yeah. I think I could find ways to spend it.
Yeah.
Hey, so after the 1919 series, Joe comes back in 1920 and has one of the best years of his career. At the age of 32, hits 382, career high of 12 home runs, knocks in 121, 20 triples, an OPS of 1.033, and then the ruling comes down and he's banned for life. Obviously, a horrible decision for him. No matter what we think, it's a horrible decision for him. But let's keep this on the field. Talk about that 1920 season. All the scandal weighing on him. How did that not affect his play? And if it did, my gosh, how much better of a season could he have had?
Yeah, I wonder if Joe is very good at compartmentalizing things. When you get up to the plate, the only thing that exists is that ball that's coming to you. And so all your off the field things about the scandal, about the strained relationships with your teammates, etc. I think Joe, was very single-minded in that way. I think Stan Musial said something about this. The only thing in the world that exists is that baseball coming at you. And as he got later in his career, and he has a restaurant in St. Louis, and Musial he was still playing when he was a grandfather. he had a baby grandfather and all that. All those things start to get into your head, and that interferes. But if a player's in his prime at about the ages of 27 to 32, this is absolutely Joe in his prime.
Yeah, I mean, he was. I mean, he was in his prime, and obviously it got cut short, and you can only guess at what could have been. I mean, in your mind, through the research you have done, David, what do you think was lost? I mean, how much better could he have gotten? I mean, he was still on the rise at the age of 32. He hits 382. Did we see the best of Joe at that point, or was there more to come?
Oh, there's definitely more to come. There are several players at that time who took a big jump up starting about 1920, 1921 or so. Because remember, they outlawed the spitball except for certain people who could continue throwing it. Yeah. After Ray Chapman's death, they worked harder to keep a clean baseball in play at all times, so that the batters could see it. There were all these changes made. There were all these changes made in playing conditions that made it easier to hit. And then people like Harry Heilman and George Sisler were hitting 400, for example. I can see Joe doing that at least a couple of times. I could see Joe continuing into the middle to late 20s, still producing at an incredible rate. I believe he had 1,772 hits. Could he have gotten to 3,000? Maybe he could have. With his high batting average, maybe he could have gotten to 3,000. So, but I also do mention in the book that Joe was so homesick for the South. He loved the South so much, he might not have played till he was 40 or 42, like Cobb did. He might not have done that. He might have said, okay, I've had enough.
Yeah, the number 3,000 probably didn't mean as much back then as it does today.
Yeah, nobody cared about that then. So,
hey, we sort of touched upon it. Just how good was he defensively? We talk a lot about his hitting, but what about in the field? Just how good was he defensively?
Well, he was very fast. He had a great arm. Like I said, he had been a pitcher down in the lowest minor leagues, but he had a terrific and very accurate arm. And so, unfortunately, I don't think we have any film of him in the field, but he had a reputation for being quite an outstanding outfielder with lots of speed. In the early years of Cleveland, he played center. Now, later in his career with the White Sox, he usually played left, but they would send him to right field if the left field was a sun field.
Oh.
They wanted to get him out of the sun field. I believe New York had a really, really vicious sun field. So they might move him around. But by reputation, yes, he was an outstanding defensive fielder.
Okay, I'm going to ask you probably the most difficult question in our interview here. It might take you a second to think about this. If you were to compare someone from today's game to Joe Jackson to help us paint a picture of the kind of ball player that Joe Jackson was, who should we look at and try to understand just how good he was?
Wow, that's a tough question. Let's see.
The name that comes to my mind, the closest thing I could get to, and maybe, I don't think I'm going to find anybody with that kind of batting average, but the guy that comes to mind is like a guy like a Ronald Acuna.
Oh, a young Joe Jackson or a young Ronald Acuna Jr. would be pretty good. I was thinking of Juan Soto. Soto is another one. I was thinking about Soto the other day, and I'm thinking, he's 24 and he's already on his third major league team. How many superstars of the game have played for their third major league team when they're 24?
Yeah. Well, I hope he ends up on this major league team next year.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know what his contract is with the Yankees or what, but I was thinking of Paul Goldschmidt, who was a left-handed batter, and of course, no one's going to have Joe's average.
No.
But a young Joe and a young Ronald Acuna Jr., I think, would be pretty. Because Ronald Acuna Jr. has no ceiling.
Exactly.
I'm so impressed with him. He just doesn't have a ceiling.
Yeah. That's. I was thinking about it, and I was like, the one guy that kept coming to mind was Ronald Acuna Jr. And yeah, so we're sort of in agreement there. Hey, what's the one thing as a player that we should know about Joe Jackson that no one ever talks about?
The one thing that no one ever talks about, just that he was such a complete player. I think everyone talks about his hitting, and of course he was an amazing hitter, but he was also a terrific base runner, stealing bases. He was stealing bases and not getting a lot of caught stealing either. Of course, they stole more bases then. The fielding, of course. And so I don't think people talk about how Joe was just so complete. They talk about what a great hitter he was and all, but he was just such a complete player, and I think that's what he deserves to be remembered for also.
Great. Hey, we know what his legacy is, obviously, but he was a career 356 hitter, a career OPS of 940, 168 triples, over 200 stolen baseballs. What did baseball miss with the banning of Joe Jackson? What did we all miss because he was banned?
Well, I think we missed the Chicago White Sox at the top of the league. They didn't win a pennant for 40 years after the Black Sox scandal. Not till 1959 did they win the pennant again. Mm-hmm. I think the death of the Black Sox, the banning of the Black Sox, gave the Yankees the dominance of the American League all through the 1920s. It would have been wonderful to see, because if they had retained Jackson, Seacott, Felsch, Weaver, Felsch and Weaver were really coming superstars, and Seacott and Williams and all that, we would have had a really wonderful battle for supremacy in the American League between the Yankees and the White Sox, probably all through up to the mid 1920s. So I think that's something that we lost with the banning of Joe, and not just his personal stats or anything, but just really marvelous. We would have had really marvelous pennant races for 5 or 6 years probably between the Yankees and the White Sox.
Wow, that's really cool. That's a really great observation. I love it. Hey, man, I want to thank you for spending some time with me to talk about Joe Jackson. I just think that, we never really talk about his career. We say, this guy deserves to be in the Hall of Fame, or he doesn't deserve to be in the Hall of Fame. He should be banned and blah, blah, blah. But no one really talks about his career and just how good he was. He was the dude, was he not? He was that good.
He was a 10-ton. He was an Albert Pujols. He was amazing. He was a fantastic player.
Wow. David, thank you so much. I really appreciate you joining me on Sports Forgotten Heroes.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Without a doubt, as we just discussed, Jackson has the resume of a Hall of Famer. But that stain from 1919 is something that cannot be overcome, and that's a shame. Because with a career batting average of .356, a career average OPS of 940, meaning every year of his career he averaged an OPS of 940, along with so many other remarkable accomplishments, the crowning achievement to his career was never realized. but I'm sure glad that we got to discuss it all right here on Sports Forgotten Heroes with a terrific baseball author in David Fleitz. Hey, thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes.